one-on-one man coverage, going up and winning 50-50 balls, batting them down.
Hey everybody, Trevor Sikkema here with another episode of Bust or Broken for you. We got a fun one this week. Today, the subject is former New York Giants cornerback Eli Apple, who has a very interesting story, a top 10 overall pick who we got to get to the bottom of. Why didn't it work out with the New York Giants? And to help us understand that, I have with me today Pat Leonard, who works for the New York Daily News. Pat is all over everything that happens with New York sports, specifically with the New York Giants. Pat, I really appreciate you joining me, man.
You got it, Trevor. I think what we're doing here with the Giants in your series is a great exercise in understanding the risk reward of the draft process, and also the fact that there's a lot of variables in certain people's control and out of other people's control that leads to how a guy actually performs. So I really like what you're doing here.
I appreciate that. It's been fun so far. We've talked some quarterbacks and we've talked some other kinds of positions, really getting to the bottom of, like you said, like context means a lot. That's why I had to get some people who really know the ins and outs of what happened with a lot of these situations. And for Eli Apple, let's take it back to draft night. Okay, this was a former 5-star overall recruit, going to Ohio State, redshirted his freshman year there, really started to come on in the years that followed, skips his final year of eligibility, goes into the draft. But he wasn't the only good corner in that draft. Jalen Ramsey and Vernon Hargreaves were also in the 2016 NFL draft. He ends up getting picked after Ramsey, obviously, but one pick before Vernon Hargreaves. My question for you, if you could take us back to draft night, is what did you think of the Leonard pick when it happened? Was corner the right move for the Giants at the time? And then what did you think of Apple being the selection overall?
It wasn't the right pick, and it wasn't the pick they wanted to make. The most interesting thing about Eli Apple's situation is so much happened on draft night that the Giants didn't even intend to have him on their team after the end of the first round. But what happened was they liked Jack Conklin, tackle from Michigan, and they like Leonard Floyd, the pass rusher from Georgia.
Oh.
So they're sitting there at 10. And what happens is the Titans traded over them to 8 to draft Conklin. And then the Bears drafted over them to 9 to draft Floyd. So Jerry Reese, the Giants general manager, as much as he had some big hits over the years as the GM, but he was always very reluctant to move around the board at draft time. And it really cost them here because even though they liked Apple as a prospect, he was not their target there. He just ended up being the highest player still on their board when their original plan fell through. And so the reason he was their highest corner and their highest player on the board there had a lot to do with how he did at the combine on the floor and the upside they saw in him. But interestingly enough, what ended up working against Apple and the Giants was he was only 20 years old. And as much as he had upside, the immaturity issues, whether it was off the field or on the field, he really was not as ready as the Giants needed him to be with the investment they were making in him. So it was a confluence of a lot of factors. And the other one I should point out to you is, of course, that was the Laramie Tunsil draft as well.
Right.
After Floyd and Conklin go, the Giants are sitting there at 10 and their phone rings and it's the Jets. The Jets wanted to move up for Tunsil. The Giants, however, did not see enough in the offer that the Jets were making to move back. When they did at that point, then look at Eli Apple and say, well, we really do love this kid's skill set. He essentially ran a 4.4 or a 4.39, whatever it was at the combine. And so they saw a long corner with upside. Again, only played 2 college years, right. But they felt like at that point, the most important thing was they did have a need at corner. It just wasn't what they were originally looking for. And so what Eli Apple's doing is he is walking into a situation where there's opportunity and a need, but he also wasn't walking into a team that had exactly penciled Eli Apple's name in from Ohio State as the Giants draft pick until they were on the clock, basically.
Man, that's fascinating because that's, if you're prioritizing an offensive tackle or an edge rusher, that's way different than picking a corner. Corner is very important. I'm one of those people who believes it is a borderline, if not premium position. You need good shutdown corners, but that is a crazy little inside story there to think of what could happen on draft night. And you've got to plan for so many different things because you never want to be left in that situation. Okay. So they make Apple the pick. That first year, believe it was Janoris Jenkins and Dominic Rogers-Cromartie who were still on the team as the corners. And so Apple was kind of that CB3 guy. But then the following year, it was him and Jenkins who were running as the starting corners. What did you see over those first 2 seasons with Apple? Or maybe even not what you saw on the field, because a lot of people could see the things that were happening on the field. Was there anything off the field that we know it kind of all came towards a big head in 2018, which we'll get to in a second, but was there reason to get excited about Eli Apple in those first 2 years or that first season, or were the waters already getting a little bit choppy with him?
There were flashes of the kind of talent that he had and that he could become, such as just defending balls down the field in one-on-one man coverage, going up and winning 50-50 balls, batting them down. He had an up and down 2016 where you said to yourself, this guy's so young that I expect him to struggle a little bit at such a premium position defending really good players.
Sure.
But you saw enough plays on the ball. He could get his hands on the ball. He had those long arms. He did have instincts. What he did not have was the ability necessarily to bounce back when it went badly. Again, going back to the maturity issues. He was one of the guys in the back of the end zone in that wild card playoff game for Aaron Rodgers' Hail Mary that devastated the Giants in that playoff loss. And Apple was one of the guys who was right there who could have made a play and didn't. Like, he was really in position to and didn't. And you saw how the team fell off. He fell off. 2017 was different from 2016, though, in that people gave a guy like Apple time in a year like 2016 where the defense still was the strength of the team. They went to the playoffs, and you see a guy growing into a role. But 2017 was the year that the wheels came off on Ben McAdoo's program and on Eli Apple's career with the Giants.
Right.
And this is part of what I really think is interesting with the debate that you're creating here over what happens with a prospect, because Eli Apple, on the one hand, there was a report that dropped in December 2017. My colleague, Dan Duggan, who's now at The Athletic, he was at the time working for NJ.com, and he wrote a story about a behind-the-scenes tug of war between Eli's very vocal mother, Annie, and some of his other family, particularly his stepfather, who had been a very stabilizing influence in his life prior to that, who, due to a falling out connected to his mother, according to Eli's brother. So this is all a secondhand story told.
Sure, right.
But essentially, the support system he had off the field collapsed. And so these allegations and comments from people close to him painted the picture of a guy who, already coming in from the draft, like there was a scout who told Bob McGinn, then of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, that Apple was so raw and so young, a guy who couldn't even cook for himself. And the phrase that stood out to that was the one that went viral, that he couldn't even cook his own meals.
Right.
But the one that stood out to me and to a lot of people was that he scares me to death, is what this guy said. And what came to a head in 2017 was when it went badly for the team, a guy like Eli Apple, whose personal support structure, according to people close to him,
Right.
had also fallen by the wayside. In addition, in 2016, we go to London. This is going back to his rookie year now.
Mm-hmm.
In 2016, we go to London with the Giants. They're playing a game against the Rams. And I'll never forget, in the locker room after that game, despite all the fanfare of they're playing a game in London and all of this, we're asking Eli Apple after that game to answer for a story his mother had written for SportsIllustrated.com, in which she was, quite legitimately, I might add, criticizing John Mara, the Giants co-owner, for insensitive language he had used in describing why the Giants had tolerated the kicker Josh Brown on their roster for so long, despite knowledge of domestic violence. And Annie Apple, Eli's mother, being a survivor of domestic violence herself, it was poignant, it was appropriate, but Eli was on the Giants. So he was caught in the middle in this specific instance. as he is having an up and down rookie year, as he's facing questions about his immaturity.
Right.
Here's a 20-year-old, 21-year-old kid sitting in the locker room in Twickenham Stadium answering questions about his mother ripping his owner for being insensitive to one of the most sensitive issues you can talk about. So that's a window into, when I mentioned the report and the allegations of what's happening behind the scenes, those are the types of things that he was dealing with off the field that maybe no one would deal with appropriately, let alone a guy who already was known for kind of struggling with how to deal with things. And then in 2017, when the wheels came off, and this is what I was alluding to when you said, is it the team? Is it the player?
Sure.
Apple was one of the Giants who, when the wheels came off, was quitting on the field. There was a game against the Rams where he basically quit on this 33-yard, I think it was a 33-yard touchdown. No, 3rd and 33 touchdown for Robert Woods, running through like the Red Sea parting with the Giants secondary. And Apple, one of the offenders of clearly not giving his best effort. And then another, I think it was the next week in Santa Clara against the Niners, quitting on the field. But now here in defense of Apple, there was a sentiment in the Giants locker room at the time that Ben McAdoo, as a fledgling NFL head coach, he was trying his best to be the player's buddy and also be the disciplinarian. And not just Apple, but even guys like Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie, he walked out of a meeting with McAdoo and got suspended for a week because they felt like there was a double standard where maybe a guy like Odell Beckham would do something crazy on the field and, you know, some antics that everyone was ticked off about, but then maybe there wasn't really any penalty as far as a fine or anything internal. But then Eli Apple felt like he gets burnt a couple times in a game against the Chargers and he lashes out and he gets benched. And now he's the public pariah. And Apple actually said publicly after the Chargers game when he got benched that the whole culture with the Giants needed to be fixed, that it wasn't just him. He was just the scapegoat. And so that was a very real thing going on at the time where Apple was one of the people who became the focus of what was going wrong. But McAdoo was struggling being consistent across the board. So a guy like Eli Apple, who was already prone to not buy in, was now calling BS on what this program really was and saying, I'm not the only one with problems, man. I'm just the one you guys are blaming. And so you could ask a very fair question, and we did at the time, and we're asking it now too, of would Eli Apple have been better off on a team with a coach who really had a firmer hand on not just managing Eli Apple, the person, but managing his team. Like we look at Joe Judge with the Giants now, making sure guys buy in from the start and that you're treating Saquon Barkley the same way you're treating the 53rd man on your roster, so that when it's time to discipline the last guy on your roster, he's not saying, well, you wouldn't do this to number 26. Because if you don't have that consistency, then you lose the locker room. And that's what happened with him. He lost the locker room.
Oh, because I remember, I mean, that is fascinating insight and detail into what happened. I mean, I remember the most famous part was Landon Collins, right? Calling, I think Eli Apple, or maybe it wasn't Eli Apple by name, but he was just saying like people were a cancer in the locker room. I remember like that's the point that we got to there. Now, that certainly explains things with McAdoo because his tenure did not end very well. And that was very public and people already knew that there. But when Pat Shurmur came in, and my follow-up question here is like, you could definitely, you know, from what you're saying, I definitely understand that. Like that just does not sound like a good environment for any player, let alone a young player, let alone one who needed a lot more structure and guidance that you could clearly see, which is not a big ask. You know, that should be a standard. Like you said there, like that should be what happens. But then in 2019, Pat Shurmur comes in and the report was that he said that Apple was going to get a clean slate, right? I think that those were his words of what he said there. Then midway through that season, Eli Apple gets traded. So was it not really a clean slate with Pat Shurmur, or did Eli Apple just new regime didn't matter? He was already kind of pissed off and done with the New York Giants organization.
Yes, it was basically a matter of that was an inevitability as long as, so if the Giants had been competitive in 2018,
Mm-hmm.
if they had been a team that was growing and building and sticking with the unit that had gotten them to the playoffs only 2 years ago, and they had seen potential in building Apple, not only just turning around what had happened off the field, but also believing that he could buy into this new program and that they were surrounding him with a structure that they were about to take off as an organization, then he would have maybe he would definitely fit in as a young, still growing corner who could have been maybe a linchpin on a Giants team that was headed in the right direction, but still a part of a long-term vision.
Mm-hmm.
But he was also caught up at the time in the Giants not knowing who they were. And going into 2018, they hired Dave Gettleman and Pat Shurmur. And Dave Gettleman and Pat Shurmur, instead of coming in and saying, this is a rebuild, and despite a guy like Eli Apple struggles, we want young, talented players we can mold, which is what Joe Judge has been doing now.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, they said, this kid can't help us win one more championship with Eli Manning. Remember, they drafted Saquon Barkley. Not that exact phrase, but that's how they're looking at the roster is we got to rebuild for the future, but we're signing Nate Solder. We're drafting Saquon Barkley. We got Will Hernandez plugging a hole in the offensive line. Let's go. And if you can't help us win, we're going to bring in a guy, B.W. Webb, who, he's not the best corner in the world, but he's a veteran. We know what his floor is, and his floor is higher to us than Apple's is. So, and this has been a problem with the Giants for years. Again, in Apple's defense, their inability to accurately assess who they were as a team and an organization leads to them saying it's the combination of they're already disgusted with what the prospect has been. They're also not looking at this as a long-term project that can turn around. So they're seeing him as this is the October 2018. This season, we tried to win again in our first year with Eli. It's already going south. We also now know that we have recent history of when things go badly here, who were two guys. Now I'm grouping Damon Harrison into this as well, because he was traded at that deadline as well. Those were two guys, Apple and Harrison, that when 2018 went south, Shurmur and Gettleman and the Giants organization said, we already have enough information to know that we misdiagnosed this season. And now these are two guys who, if we're not committing to the long term and we don't have the culture to support the issues going on behind the scenes, we got to get them out of here. And so it's not only the Giants, because obviously Apple, as we head into 2021, he's on his fourth team in 6 years.
Right.
With the Bengals now. So it's not only the Giants, but, we're talking a lot about, too, what happened with the prospect and the player and his immaturities. And there really was a lot to the situation he was in that wasn't conducive to success for him and many others. And interesting piece of trivia, too, is when he got suspended by the Giants at the end of the 2017 season, when everything went down with Landon Collins, you mentioned, who suspended him is an interesting trivia. It wasn't Dave Gettleman, who was on his way in. It wasn't Jerry Reese, who was already fired. It was interim GM Kevin Abrams. So that's an interesting piece of trivia, was Abrams actually was the one suspending Eli Apple and announcing conduct detrimental to the team in late December. It's really interesting. You could tell the story of the Giants at that time through this player, and you can tell the player's story through the story of the Giants.
Man, I'm not going to lie, Pat. I went into this video thinking we were going to come up with the conclusion that, Eli Apple's a bust. You talked about even since his time with the New York Giants, he's bounced around the NFL. He's been on a bunch of different teams. He's on a new team again this year. So I'm like, all right, so there's some context in it. You go, okay, it might not have been all his fault, but I was thinking bust. At this point, when you mention his age going into the NFL, some of the surroundings that were there, and it's not like these things were totally unknown, right? I mean, even if you didn't exactly think you were going to draft a player, once you do, you learn everything about them. You learn that, hey, we might have to support this guy in different ways. And it just sounds like, both from a coaching perspective, lifeline perspective, playtime perspective, even maybe locker room perspective, they didn't. And that lends me to make you feel like, they're part of the accountability has to be on Apple, but more so the conclusion here is that he was broken by a franchise that was at the time broken. Am I correct? Is that the conclusion we're coming up to here?
I do think there's blame on both sides. I would say this, though, too, in blaming the organization part of it. Jerry Reese is a GM. He drafted some players and took some chances. Let's say Odell Beckham Jr., whatever you think of him. Mm-hmm. That was an amazing player, an amazing pick, and Jerry Reese, of course, drafting guys like Jason Pierre-Paul. Even David Wilson looked like he was going to be something before he broke his neck. But you look at guys like Eli Apple and Eric Flowers. Now, Eric Flowers, of course, he goes to the Dolphins. He changes positions, and he started a lot of games now in the NFL, and almost seems like he's turned into a more reliable NFL player as he's gotten older and gotten through all of the bad stuff in those early years. But I bring up Eric because Flowers and Apple, when Jerry Reese was GM, are two examples of players that Reese, the GM, selected, seeing upside and a lot of physical talent, but almost underestimating how difficult and maybe how much of a hindrance their age and youth and immaturity would be.
Yeah.
And I think in hindsight, you can look back at that and see what the rationale was and what the mistake was compared to maybe selecting a guy who might not have had the same upside, but was more of a sure thing and a known commodity. And so, yes, I certainly agree with what you just said in that this is way less about just Eli Apple and way more about, there was plenty about the organization and the fit, the way they mismanaged the draft and the way the franchise was mismanaged at the time that didn't give him a chance. But I just would add that the silver or the qualifier there is that specifically to me, Apple's quitting on the field for all the off-field stuff and the immaturity that Landon was talking about behind the scenes, which was absolutely true. The quitting on the field and game stuff, to me, I don't care what's going on. When that happens in a game, even DeAndre Baker, after McAdoo's gone, another misevaluation by a new GM and new coach. But when a guy quits on the field, you just can't, even if you blame the coaches for, not instilling fundamentals, whatever it is, that's on the player, that he doesn't care enough to chase a guy out of bounds or whatever it is. So, but certainly, yes, if you were going into this thinking Eli Apple was a bust no matter where he got drafted, there are certainly enough variables about the Giants situation that can tell you that it could have worked out differently if there were more structure to the situation he had been in.
I think you're totally right, because we actually just did an episode of this very show on Vernon Hargreaves, and we talked about how the system that he was brought into in Tampa Bay and how things kind of let him down or really didn't take him down the right path in his first couple of years. But ultimately, the reason why he was released by Tampa is the effort thing. It's because Bruce Arians saw him give up on one play and went, I don't care what's going on around you. I don't care what your past has been. If you quit on me on the field, I'm done with you. I can't work with you. And so, guys, right. I mean, I don't even need to say anything else. That was fantastic inside information. That's all the reason that I need to tell you guys to go follow Pat Leonard, both on Twitter, on Instagram. Go follow his work. He does an unbelievable job covering the New York Giants and really everything that happens in the NFL, wherever he could get his hands and his eyes on some stuff. He's one of the best NFL reporters out there. Pat, I really appreciate you coming, joining me, and shedding some light on a situation, topic, and player that is often debated, but I don't think ever covered to this detail, man. This is fantastic stuff.
You got it, Trevor. Thanks. And again, this is a great series. I love it. It's a terrific idea. I'm looking forward to seeing all the other discussions you've had on these different teams and players, because it really does. This context does not get discussed enough in our news cycle, and it needs to be, to really understand how the league works and how these players have progressed or declined.
We've had a lot of fun recording them so far. We're going to have more fun as the draft season rolls on. We will have a new episode of Buster Broken coming up next week. We'll see you guys then.